Today, we're diving into how the policies of the IMF and World Bank can influence poverty in developing countries. On the surface, the IMF and World Bank seem well-intentioned, initially set up to help rebuild war-torn economies after World War II and later aiding developing countries. They've funded infrastructure projects and provided emergency loans, but critics argue their policies often do more harm than good, exacerbating poverty and inequality in the long run. So buckle up, because we're about to unpack some dense economic jargon and explore the unintended consequences of good intentions. Let's start with the IMF and World Bank's favourite party trick structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. The basic idea behind SAPs is this: a developing country needs a loan and the IMF or World Bank attaches conditions. These conditions, bundled together like a dystopian gift basket, are what we call structural adjustment programs. SAPs often require countries to implement austerity measures, slashing public spending on essential services like healthcare and education. They also encourage privatization, leading to job losses and higher prices for essential services. SAPs promote export-oriented growth, focusing on producing goods for foreign markets rather than meeting local needs. In theory, these measures are supposed to stabilize economies and attract foreign investment. But in practice, they often exacerbate poverty and inequality, leaving countries trapped in a cycle of debt and dependence. Let's talk about the environment and the hidden costs of what we often call development. The World Bank has a reputation for funding large-scale infrastructure projects that can have devastating impacts on the environment and local communities. These projects are often seen as necessary for economic growth. We're talking massive dams, sprawling mines and pipelines, all in the name of development. These structures are impressive, but they come with a heavy environmental price tag. But it's often the indigenous communities and small-scale farmers who bear the brunt, losing their land and livelihoods. Their voices are frequently drowned out in the rush to modernize. Deforestation, habitat loss, pollution and greenhouse gas emissions are just a few of the unintended consequences. These environmental issues contribute to climate change and biodiversity loss. The World Bank argues it has learned from past mistakes and is now more committed to sustainable development. They claim to be integrating environmental considerations into their projects. They have implemented some environmental and social safeguards. These measures are designed to minimize harm and promote sustainability. But critics argue these safeguards are often inadequate and poorly enforced. They point out that the implementation is inconsistent and sometimes superficial. So, while the World Bank might talk a big game about sustainability, the reality on the ground often tells a different story. The gap between policy and practice remains a significant challenge. Remember those strings attached to IMF and World Bank loans? They're more like the strings of a puppeteer, controlling the actions of a borrower country. When the IMF or World Bank lends money, they come armed with a laundry list of conditions. These conditions can cover a wide range of policy areas, from fiscal policy to trade to labour laws. Critics argue that these loan conditions can undermine local democratic processes and erode national sovereignty. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You might be able to force it in there, but it's not going to be pretty. So while the IMF and World Bank argue these conditions are necessary, critics see them as a form of economic colonialism. Now let's talk about inequality. It's a topic that has been at the forefront of many discussions, yet solutions seem elusive. The IMF and World Bank often talk about poverty reduction, but their policies often exacerbate the very inequalities they claim to address. These institutions advocate for austerity measures that can lead to severe social consequences. They prioritize macroeconomic stability, keeping inflation in check and balancing budgets. While these goals are important, they often overshadow the immediate needs of the population. But this focus often comes at the expense of social spending, like healthcare, education, and social safety nets. These are the very pillars that support a healthy and educated society. When you prioritize macroeconomic stability over social spending, the gap between the rich and the poor tends to widen. This growing disparity can lead to social unrest and economic instability. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the middle class gets squeezed. This creates a society where opportunities are limited for the majority. The IMF and World Bank argue that economic growth will eventually trickle down to the poor. They believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, but trickle-down economics has been debunked so many times that it's practically an urban legend. The benefits of economic growth often remain concentrated at the top. The reality is that prioritizing macroeconomic stability over social spending ignores the needs of the most vulnerable. These communities are left to fend for themselves, often with devastating consequences. So, where do we go from here? This is a question that resonates deeply as we stand at a crossroads, reflecting on the past and contemplating the future. It's clear that the IMF and World Bank, despite their good intentions, have a lot to answer for. Their policies, while aimed at fostering global economic stability, have often fallen short of their lofty goals. Their policies have contributed to poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation in many parts of the world. The impact on local communities has been profound, leading to a cycle of hardship that is difficult to break. While the IMF and World Bank have made efforts to reform, it's crucial to continue advocating for policies that prioritize inclusive growth and the well-being of the most vulnerable populations. These reforms must be more than just surface-level changes. They need to address the root causes of the issues. We need greater transparency and accountability from these institutions, as well as a fundamental shift in how we think about development. This means rethinking our approach to economic aid and ensuring that it truly benefits those in need. It's time to move away from the one-size-fits-all model of development and recognize that there is no single path to prosperity. Each community has unique needs and strengths that must be acknowledged and leveraged. We need to listen to the voices of those most affected by these policies, empower local communities, and prioritize sustainable and equitable solutions that benefit everyone, not just the privileged few. By doing so, we can create a more just and prosperous world for all.